ourselves how we might work around this problem that I consider really to be a global problem. And the problem is basically work that needs to be done to keep the academy going, but that may not be well recognized or rewarded. So let me begin by introducing the panel, and then I paint a backdrop, and then we will have a discussion after that. And I hope that the audience can really participate because you will see this is really a pressing problem. And I'll give you more information as to why other people have stepped up. I'm a professor at the Wikimi School at Nanyang Technological University from Singapore, 36 hours flying travel time from Singapore. I work in the area of media law and policy, and in particular on internet governance. And I was the immediate past president of the ICA. My term just ended in May of this year. On my immediate left is Barbie Zelizer, who was a past president of the ICA as well. Let me read key points, highlights in her career. She's currently the Raymond Williams Professor of Communication and Director of the Scholars Program in Culture and Communication at the Annenberg School of Communication at UPenn. She's a former journalist and co-editor and founder of the journal Journalism, Theory, Practice, and Criticism by SAGE. She has lectured widely both internationally and nationally, and her essays on the media have appeared in The Nation, News Hour, Jim Lehrer, Newsday, and the Huffington Post. Her most recent single-authored book is award-winning About to Die, How News Images Move the Public. It was published by Oxford in 2010. She, besides being a past president of the ICA, she has been a Guggenheim Fellow at Stanford University's Center for the Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences, Research Fellow at the Freedom Forum Media Studies Center, Fellow at Harvard University's Joan Sorensen Center on the Press, Politics, and Public Policy, and a Fulbright Senior Scholar. On her left is Silvio Waisbord, who's the professor in the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University. He's editor-in-chief of the Journal of Communication and former editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Press and Politics. He's published articles on news and politics, journalism, global health communication, communication social change, and media policy. He holds a licentiate, I hope I get it pronounced correctly, in sociology from the University of Buenos Aires, and a PhD in sociology from the University of California, San Diego. And on his left is Jairo Lugo-Ocando, and he just told me that Jairo is a very common name here. Okay. And part of it is that Jairo was born not so far from here. Quite amazing. Find somebody born not so far from here. He's associate professor and deputy head of the School of Media and Communication, University of Leeds. He has worked in several universities in the UK and has been a visiting research fellow at the University of Católica Andrés Bellos at Venezuela and at the National University of Singapore. And in fact, that's how I met him when he came by to Singapore. He's also been a visiting lecturer in the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University in New York, and a visiting professor of doctoral program in media and communication at the University of Malaga, Spain. He's the deputy editor of the Journal of Applied Journalism and Media Studies and Journal of Latin American Communication Research. He was a journalist and currently contributes columns and commentaries for several publications and radio programs in Latin America. So I think between us, we have a good spread of background expertise, covering Latin America, of course, USA, Asia to some extent, and also with a heavy emphasis on research, and in our cases, in particular in journalism. So let me begin by painting the backdrop so you understand why we're having this panel. Okay, so the basic problem is this, that in our academic world, as you all here realize, we cannot function without people doing work for free. Right? So the example I give here is reviewing papers and research proposals. We need people to review them, and they're basically not paid, or they're paid minimally. I get paid about $100 US for reviewing some research proposals out of Hong Kong. And you know the hours it would take to do a research proposal review. But in other cases, there's little or no reward at all. But people have to do them. And as the world looks more and more into research, what we are finding is that universities are demanding more and more of such reviews. So looking at the issue, this whole rubric will be called academic citizenship. In other words, what do you do to get the academy going? And the answer, of course, to be good citizens. But what is a good citizen in the academy, right? So this is from an author, Bruce McFarlane, who's done some work in this area literally 10 years ago now, right? So he's gone out to get, I think about 30 in his article, about 30 persons to respond. Of course, sent out more than that, but he got 30 responses. And so these definitions that I will put up here, they are from his paper. So we're talking about belonging to a group. That's what academic citizenship is. A learning community, right? Second one is belonging to a community with a set of values, rules, and objectives, okay? And with an idea of how we contribute to society at large. So, okay, going on, being part of the wider academic community, contributing scholarly activity or research, right? And then the fourth one here, being in the faculty, a willingness to work with others, to take part in projects and so on. So you can see how being in the community is part of academic citizenship. And I guess in this group, certainly, I feel I'm preaching to the choir here. You know that to actually have knowledge, contribute to knowledge, you cannot work alone. In the end, you get cults, right? You get cults and occults, and because they work alone, they feel they have the answer. For us, being part of the community is what it means to contribute to knowledge at the end of the day. Knowledge is not built in a silo. Knowledge is built when you are able to have your work reviewed and critiqued by others. Oh, let's see. Okay. So what is it? What are the implications of being an academic citizen, right? Of academic citizenship. So again, this is from Bruce McFarlane's work. Staying up to date, supporting students, and actually these are things that I think in this group we all do, right? We just haven't tabulated them. Supporting organization, sharing expertise. Okay, and the second one, supportive of students, colleagues, and stakeholders. The third one, oops, sorry, I missed that head. Doing a bit as an academic, okay, right? And this is the point, right? It's limited amount of money in the academic world. A lot of things will fall flat otherwise. I think all of us have travel economy, right, to come here. My students, my first batch of students, in the very first batch, one of them has retired or semi-retired. And we met for lunch and he says, things must be going well for you, right? You're traveling business. And I stopped him right there. I said, no, I travel economy. And he was shocked. This student of mine, he's semi-retired, he's in his 40s now. He says there was one year where he was the third highest United Airlines frequent flyer miles collected, right? Something like 500,000 or some ridiculous number like that. Okay, and he assumed that I travel as a professor. I would travel business, and it shocked him that I was traveling economy. But we do this because there's a limited amount of money, right? And we all feel that the money could go to better causes such as education. Number 4, that we have responsibilities that extend beyond our immediate colleagues, student discipline. And then the implications, okay, for those of you who just came in, I'm missing this head, right? The implications of academic citizenship. Number 5 is going beyond our contractual obligations. And this is part of the issue, right? That academic citizenship is not in a contract. It is not written in our contract with our universities. If it's a contract at all, it's a contract between us, you and me, as fellows in a community, in an association, right? And you can see how that without this implied contract, our world literally falls apart. Literally, you can't have this conference. Who would review the papers, right? And if every review has to be paid, how will you charge, right? So and think about those who organize the sessions, right? Were they paid? No, they were not. Were they rewarded? Maybe not. Right? So this is the whole nub of the problem in our academic citizenship. And I also wanted to tell you the kind of amount of service actually that is implied or that needs to be done, right? And this again, this is from another source, talking about sort of service generally speaking, right? So at the top, you have public service, profession, the institution, your university, just being collegial, and student service. Let's put at the bottom because that's really a big part of why we have service, right? So that we are helping our students. Okay, so let me come to this nub of the issue, and then I'm going to pass on the mic to Barbie, and then Silvio and Jairo. Oh, sorry, guys, I got you guys, your order mixed up. Sorry. Barbie, Jairo, and Silvio. Okay. All right, so the issue is this, right? There is a lack of recognition or reward. To be fair, some places do recognize that, right? They do recognize service, generally in kind of a limited amount. So to take my university as an example, we have a scoring system that is based on points, and the points are 5, 5, 2. 5 for service, 5 for research, 5 for teaching, and 2 for service, right? And it used to be 4, 4, 2. Then it got lowered. So you can see how the service component really got diluted, right? When you went from 4, 4, 2 to 5, 5, 2, right? So it's now 2 out of 12, as opposed to 2 out of 10. So there is recognition, but really limited, right? So the work that I do for the ICA is really limited in recognition in my own university. But I still think it's an important role, you know, so I'm not complaining, don't misunderstand. But the other places that I'm really surprised that they have very little recognition at all for service, and so how should we respond, right? So on that note, I'm going to pass the microphone now to Barbie, and then to Silvio, and then to Jairo. Okay, so Barbie. Yeah. Thank you.
Good morning. I want to thank you all for being here, and I want to say that being in a room this big, it kind of emblematizes what it feels like talking about academic citizenship today. You know it's important, you know that it's worth articulating, but there aren't always a great number of people out there willing to listen to what you say, and I think that this is worth thinking about as we kind of wrestle what academic citizenship means, particularly in today's circumstances. And I think that though I'm happy to be on this panel, I have to say at the outset that contemplating academic citizenship today in today's political climate is so difficult because the minute one thinks that one's on top of things, they change. So what I want to do, if we can ever get my slides going, is I want to think small from my position in the US at a private university, a well-endowed program, which clearly is going to impact what I have to say, but I think that it's important to get everybody talking from various vantage points, so I hope you'll take what I have to say with a grain of salt. So the biggest academic change today is that staying abreast of current political turmoil necessitates changing the default setting of the university, and that implicates 3 intertwined dimensions of that setting: form, content, and function. And without changing all 3, I would say that the chance of underscoring the university's relevance is pretty much a non sequitur. Okay, let's just forget about the slides. Okay. Universities, to begin with, are slow-moving institutions. Models of academic engagement go back centuries, and the university's orientation to change has always been incremental and plodding. And this has always been the case, and I think that we can certainly think back to Thomas Kuhn's writings on paradigm change, but it puts the university at odds with the changing reality of its surrounding institutional culture. It's not working. For too long, universities have operated as if knowledge acquisition were free of larger institutional concerns, free of politics, free of religion, free of the military, free of market interests, even free of strategizing, however it is that we tend to think about that term. And yet, higher education exists not separate, but in tandem with politics, economics, social welfare, law, religion, security, the military, and they impede differently in different locations. So that when we're talking about academic citizenship or the university, it's very hard to generate any kind of sense of things being common. But by not admitting the connection in any of its forms, we can't track its nuances. And because institutional culture is rife with all kinds of unarticulated practices, Okay, because institutional culture is rife with all kinds of unarticulated practices, and I'll just mention a few: interinstitutional dependency, entrenched power sharing, tension between normative ideals and daily practice, complicated patterns of ownership and management, a gravitation toward impunity, a tendency toward self-censorship, inequities related to race, class, gender, and age. Their impact intrudes on academic personnel, values, and resources in silent and, I would argue, insidious ways. And this means that no academic institution anywhere can afford anymore to look away from the changes characterizing institutional culture writ large. Looking away mutes academe's role in thinking institutions from anew. And the fact that the majority of university-educated folk in the US voted for Clinton over Trump, and for Remain over Leave in the UK, and both lost, should be a wake-up call. That remaining to the side of today's political developments makes academe part of the problem rather than its solution. So that universities need to become that place for nuance and disagreement, as well as knowledge and truth. Because for too long, the latter have been pushed aside by the former, or the latter have pushed aside the former. But unfortunately, this means that when populists rise up, as they are doing ever increasingly, and harp on what they see as an elite, detached, disinterested university, they aren't far from the mark. In the US, for instance, Trump's democratic backsliding as a rogue institutional player impedes knowledge and information flow across the institutional environment. So he refuses to meet the media, and in either direct or indirect response, other institutional players like news outlets, social movements, regional advocacy groups refuse to meet him. And I think that we need to be thinking about this as a fundamental change in how institutions work, because the give and take of institutional culture is eroding incessantly and across the board. And universities have to understand the ways in which they are part of this dynamic. In moving forward, we need to recognize that academic forms are necessarily interconnected with other institutions, that academic content needs to provoke disagreement as much as thoughtful intake, and academic function necessitates a civic role in addition to an intellectual one. Unfortunately, the idea of a civic role certainly gets touted unfairly. I think that it has been the case, certainly in the UK, that thinking about a civic role for the university tends to diminish academic authority, but I don't think that that needs to be necessarily the case. So how to reset the relationship between our research, our teaching, our service, and their roots in the communities around us? I want to offer 4 A's. The first A, and this was a really great slide, but we're not going to get there. The first A is articulate. No more academizing from nowhere. If we want to draw in intellectual engagement of others, we have to be explicit about why. And this means absolutely and totally abandoning the fiction that we have value-free academic goals, whether they're in research, in service, or in teaching, and transforming them into activities that are shaped both as a means to satisfy intellectual curiosity, as well as ensuring freedom and dignity of conversation, of opinion, of sentiment, of difference. For too long, the latter have not been part of the picture. Articulating means recognizing threats, calling them by name, devising ways to protect the free flow of knowledge and information. And I'm thinking here about a number of initiatives that are going on around the United States, sponsored by the Goldwater Institute, the initiatives are attempting to bar freedom of information as special zones on campuses. For students and professors, we have to lay bare why that matters. And if we don't, we shouldn't be surprised when university professors, particularly precarious labor, are losing their jobs because of voicing opinions. The second A is adjust. Adjusting means accommodating our research curricula and service to better accommodate diverse publics in a way that will make university education more accessible and less strange. It is not a source of pride, for me at least, and I think for many in the United States, that those speaking against the university feel that they have been disserviced by the university. And this means diversifying our tools of academic engagement by creating pathways for different kinds of academic input and output. And I know that Latin America is so far ahead of other places in the world in terms of thinking about alternative modes of intellectual engagement. So I think that there's a lesson to be learned here. Some examples: fostering student-faculty engagement, not just in the academic classroom, encouraging various, not necessarily complementary modes of student recruitment or faculty hiring, so as to get different people across the landscape. Encouraging practices like popular writing or filmmaking as relevant not only to the classroom, but to promotion and tenure. For too long, there's been a kind of silent agreement that it's okay to do it to attract students, but it's not going to matter in terms of one's elevation up the hierarchical rank. And working around the pitfalls of the university structure, and I think this is really the hardest thing. University constraints, for instance, force us to pay heed to what's pre-planned, what's scheduled, what's anticipated, and it leaves us unable to kind of create a timely response to anything. But could we turn this off, please? But knowledge generation occurs on the back of timely response. So recognizing that what we teach is in process, is definitionally incomplete, and is porous rather than rigid and formalized might better enable us to mount immediate and last-minute interventions to topical events and issues, something we have not typically been good at. The third A is align. Being part of the reset of institutional culture requires thinking about which other institutional forces are worth aligning with. And that's because opening the university to more than its ivory tower means incorporating other institutional settings and actors within the university frame. And here I'm thinking about reframing alignment and activism in much the same way that we think about different intellectual tracks, right? Or different disciplines. We know how to recognize different modes of engagement insofar as they are intellectually identified. Why can't we do the same thing with practical difference? There are already many possibilities already out there. I'm thinking about the Scholars at Risk Network that provides haven or refuge for those in conflict zones. I'm thinking about working for social justice. I mean, these are very clear initiatives. I think that they simply need to be more in number and more in prominence. Collaborating with people outside of the academy should not be a choice anymore. And facilitating, again, a sense of student worth and by extension our own by encouraging them how to figure out how to connect life and school as complementary, not polarized choices. And then finally, abandon. None of this can work without letting go of a whole lot of academia's default setting. And I think that we have to recognize that the moment of opportunity is almost past. It's not that it's just presenting itself, it is almost past. We need to get rid of our privilege and our exceptionalism and our elitism and our moral superiority. So one final note. I might say, as a cheerleader for the discipline, that communication and media studies is supremely qualified to lead the journey toward academic reset. Its embrace of epistemic plurality, multiple ontological, epistemological, methodological viewpoints, its blend of empirical and critical worlds, its mix of qualitative and quantitative methods, a long-held orientation to interdisciplinarity that involves becoming amenable to sharing with other disciplines rather than racing against them. And most important, a solid tradition, which we have not yet come to embrace fully, a solid tradition of applied knowledge. We have a different theory-practice connection in this discipline that positions it like few others to turn academic citizenship into more than just an idea. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Barbie. Yeah. I began with actually somewhat narrow and a much narrower scope, and I'm glad she has broadened that discussion. And so on a note about broadening, I would like to now hand the microphone to Silvio, who is, for those of you who missed the introduction, he's the editor of Journal of Communication. So the clicker's there.
Thank you very much, Ang, for the invitation and for IAMCR to offering us this space, and all of you for being here. I think that I will focus on both concepts here, both academic citizenship and the demanding times. And I want to emphasize that the question of demanding times is very different for scholars around the world because of different local conditions. So we have to be aware that when we're talking about demanding times, they are not equally demanding for the same reasons or with the same level of intensity. Just to mention something, my understanding is that many colleagues from Turkey were unable to attend IAMCR given political restrictions. So that's just to me symptomatic of the fact that we have to be aware that when we talk about demanding times, we're talking about different things. It is clear, and this is the premise of this panel, that the academic work is under sort of multiple attacks in different parts of the world, political, corporate, and the attacks are on fundamental aspects of the intellectual mission of higher education, which, in my understanding, is to provide expertise on the mission of science and rigor, on facticity, on the possibility of truth, even though it's as elusive as it must be, and also on the capacity for scholarly work to dissent, to say what society doesn't want to recognize. But also is the fact that we have in different countries around the world, and this applies to both the global north and the global south, the distrust of science writ large, no matter how we understand science, in large pockets of the public and actual mobilized citizens against the fundamental mission of academic work. And on top of that, if these were not enough challenges, is the rise of an anti-political correctness discourse and the fact that free speech, at least in the countries that I know better, free speech has been hijacked by the right as a prerogative of basically saying whatever comes to mind rather than linking free speech to central democratic values. So the question is how to respond to these multiple attacks, considering that these attacks and the intensity are different around the world. And I think that the response in many ways is very simple. And I will say a few things that already have been said in many venues for a long time in different parts of the world, but I think that it's necessary to refresh our memory about this. As Andre Gide said, everything has been said, but people were not listening, therefore it has to be said again. So what we need to do is basically to produce public knowledge. This is an argument that has recently again been made by sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists, just to use two names in the US academia that have made a very powerful argument around these issues is Baraway's notion of the idea that the reason to know is to change society, and political scientist Jane Mansbridge saying something similar around the need for an activist scholarship or for engaged intellectual work. So what does it mean? And so let me tell you what, in my mind, are ideals of intellectual work. And of course, it's a long-standing discussion around this. In my mind, scholarly work, intellectual work, and I use them deliberately as synonymous, is the role of the dissenter, the truth teller, and the expert. And what we need to do, and let me talk about the ideals and then I'll talk about how this matches reality, is to try to search for autonomy. Without autonomy, it's very difficult to take critical positions, to demonstrate the value of facts and truth as central to the academic mission. But at the same time, we have to remain skeptical of both power in different manifestations as well as utopias, as sort of counter projects to power. Particularly today, I think that we also need to have a good eye, maintain a sense of proportion, meaning what is happening today, how does it compare to previous similarly troubling times in the life of democracy and public life around the world and in specific communities, right? This is something that academia in principle should be able to tell, how this moment compares to previous times. Also, I think that we have to practice what we typically praise and preach, which is the values of democratic deliberation. Engagement, listening, understanding, tolerance, open-mindedness, and in my mind, not always we reflect in our exchanges the kind of democratic dialogue we often praise. And finally, I think that we also have to be anti-conformist and anti-dogmatic. And in my mind, what this means is to constantly revisit the premises that guide our own work and ask questions that we don't know the answers. If we knew the answers that potentially can challenge our own convictions, what would be the point of knowledge? And there are many sort of ways in which these ideas have been summarized. One of my favorite quotes is a well-known statement by Edward Said, who said that the public intellectual is the scoffer whose place it is publicly to raise embarrassing questions, to confront orthodoxy and dogma, to be someone who cannot easily be co-opted by government or corporations. The little small problem is that these ideals are in constant tension with academic commitments, with loyalties, with identities, with the real existing conditions of academia, many of which both Peng and Barbie already mentioned. Meaning the conditions of the academic field, and this varies across universities, across countries, are not well suited for these kinds of ideals that I just laid out. Basically because the intersection between the academic field with other fields, the political and economic field particularly, are better. And the idea of field, of course, sounds better in the original French. So what I think that we need to do is let's not just praise ideas, the normative notions of what we would like to do, what is needed now, but we have to understand better the context of practice, what is possible, what is feasible within the conditions of practice. And in a globalized academia, we should not generalize about the position of scholars, both in academic settings as well as in society at large. And there are different traditions in different countries about the position of intellectuals as well as scholars in this. So let me just to state the obvious. The situation and the challenges are different around the world and the traditions as well. The parts of the world that I know better, the US and Latin America, have widely different traditions in terms of the position of academics and intellectuals, as well as what are the challenges for doing this kind of public scholarship that I just described. In the US, it's well known that is a long-standing sort of, that intellectual is attached to a disparaging connotation, not much love for intellectuals. In Latin America, instead, it's a much more complex, different situation. And in my mind, there's a longer tradition of actually endorsing public commitment in academic work, as opposed to, quote unquote, the neutral scientific tradition, mostly in US academia, plus the political activism and work actually outside of universities. There's a closer relation between scholars historically to politics, to people, and power. And I'm not romanticizing this, I'm just trying to make a descriptive statement about differences. And of course, the situation is different in authoritarian or semi-authoritarian contexts. Today will be Turkey and Hungary will be two examples of the firing of scholars, shutting down universities, clamping down on free speech. But also because I think the historical position depends on sort of the credibility and the visibility of scholars. Who listens to what we have to say? Why will someone outside of academia will listen to what we have to say? Especially as we are sort of the target of attacks for a variety of reasons. But also because this situation varies across the field of communication. In my experience, many of our colleagues in fields such as health communication, communication for social change, documentarians, scholars in media policy, scholars working in children and media, journalism studies, have very different relationships with non-university actors, sort of in engagement with different fields outside of academia. And this, to me, sort of goes to the central question here, which is how do we write? Who do we write for? Who do we talk to? And in my mind, I like this phrase by Russell Jacoby from his well-known book about intellectuals in the US, which he put it that the politics of tenure, which in my mind is basically university expectations, obligations, commitments, loom larger than the politics of culture at large. That to be a principal investigator, these are my words, is more pressing than to be a public intellectual. This is really related, to, at least in the US, with a strong tradition of positivism and the idea of a clear separation between science and politics. But to me, it goes to a deeper phenomenon, which is that we tend to live in rarefied environments, in very enclosed spaces. In fact, that's one of the conditions to actually become an academic, to master certain conditions that are unique to our identity and our culture. But at the same time, it's a separation from ordinary life. So in some ways, we're not that different from the same ordinary citizens that we criticize for living in bubbles, in digital bubbles, having a very narrow feed. Because we rarely cross-cut, even within academia, across areas, perspectives, that not necessarily we're in tune with, or necessarily that we recognize as eventually related to us. So to me, the problem here is how do we encounter difference? If we have a hard time encountering difference within the field of academic work, it will be impossible to think about academic difference outside of the university. In my experience working for many years with international agencies, NGOs, journalists, and governments, what I find is that basically people have a hard time understanding us. And all the cliches, that's what people actually say, that we are too abstract, too theoretical, not practical enough, that actually we're not very good communicators, that we actually are not good translators. How do we translate the work that we do to different audiences? But also here there is a profound irony, which is, on the one hand, we value criticism. I still have to attend a panel or read a paper in which someone says criticism is bad. But actually, we distrust critics. We rarely engage with critics, including non-academic critics, who might have different takes on our work. Rarely we move outside of our comfort zones by engaging with various publics who are not necessarily familiar with the work that they do, yet we think that potentially there is something productive in common. Why? Because the encounter with the non-academic world is too risky in terms of demonstrating the value of our own work, our reputation, our credibility, because the currency outside of academic world is different from the currency that we trade in, that we exchange in academic work. And another point here, to me, is very important, and this is, I have a Latin American case in mind here. Los que hablan español podemos seguir la conversación después, porque esto es una historia bastante larga. I just said that those who speak Spanish, I will be happy to continue this conversation in Spanish after the panel, which is the question of the collusion of academics with power and the refusal to criticize power and abuses in all its manifestations. So in the last 15 years, my take is that there has been a divide in academia, reflects actually a divide in the left in Latin America, over a so-called cultural battle about the role of intellectuals and academics in our societies. And it has been swallowed by a climate of polarization among elites. So the academic field in academia, in Latin America, particularly communication studies, is as divided as societies at large. And in my view, the danger, the problem, has been already pointed out famously by Julien Brenda in his book, The Betrayal of the Intellectuals. Yes, to remind, it was a critique of Jean-Paul Sartre, etc. Continue that. And basically, Brenda's point was that the passion and ideological commitment cloud critical thinking and betray principles of intellectual work. So in my mind, the question of public engagement is not necessarily good by itself. Why? Because it can also lead to espousing a Sartrean approach to intellectual and politics in which we lose critical distance deliberately, in which we run the risk of endorsing power that attacks or disregards basic principles of intellectual work, in which subject to criticisms to political calculations, in which intellectuals participate in ad hominem attacks or justifying shutting down critical thought. And of course, this is not just a question of ideological conviction or support for a political regime, but it's also a question of economic and financial links between universities and power. As Upton Sinclair famously said, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it. And my last comments on this question is, what are the ways of going public, forms of public engagement? I start from the premise that any form of intellectual work is to be a public intellectual. A public intellectual is not someone who is in the so-called Rolodex of journalists. I don't think journalists use Rolodex anymore, but it's just a metaphor these days. So, because all the work that we do it's public. The question is how public it is. And again, there are different ways of going about this. One will be linking with institutions and communities of practice outside of academia, and Barbie eloquently talked about this already. I'm not going to go into that. Second is what we, or many of us, think about as media appearances. But many of our colleagues in communications studies already have warned about the limitations of the rules of engagement with media appearances because of what we'll know in terms of editorial standings, definition of newsworthiness. So we know that better than any academic in principle in terms of when an academic voice becomes news, typically tied to conventional definitions of what is news. But what to me one of the most fruitful, interesting spaces for public intellectual these days is net activism writ large. And I'm not just talking about engaging with different communities of practice in digital space, but just social media activities we can do individually or collectively. And this is very risky today because many colleagues that I know around the world have been the target of attacks by trolls and many others because of their digital presence. It's becoming easier for many people outside of academia to launch attacks against us because when we go public on social media or different media platforms, then sort of we are part of this ongoing struggle between those who don't believe in science, don't believe in the academic mission, and us. So it's an opportunity at the same time that is a new risk. In closing, what I think that what we need to do to cultivate public communication scholarship. Very simple, to defend facts and truth as elusive and contested as they are. One thing is to believe that truth and facts are socially constructed. Something else is completely reject, flat out, the possibility of facts and truth. Second, there are multiple forms of engagement, and in my mind, the notion of translation is critical here. But unfortunately, and I think Barbie gestured this at the very beginning of presentation, is that we don't pay enough attention to this. It's not something that we, especially because we are pulled into the typical sort of conventions of academic work, into this. So I think that, especially given that this is an ICA panel at IAMCR, and I thank IAMCR for this opportunity, is something that at least the two institutions should work on, and having joint work, joint projects, joint publications, in terms of documenting, doing a comparative, for example, analysis of positions and the place of criticism in two institutions that increasingly are more global. And I hope that someone from IAMCR, from the executive committee is here so we can continue this conversation, because to me, this is an opportunity, especially because of the challenge that we are facing around the world. In summary, and this is my conclusion, there are similar sort of challenges, but in different contexts. And the opportunities and the risks are different too. And I think that in my mind, what we have to continue doing is to raise awareness about conditions, to defend the university as an autonomous space for critical thinking no matter what, need to engage beyond the classroom, and actually to actively show solidarity, especially with colleagues who are the targets of attacks from power around the world. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Silvio. It's really inspiring to hear this. The issue of defending facts and truth in this climate. In Singapore, we are talking about passing some laws on fake news, and of course, I'm involved in a debate. But the issue of defending facts and truth is not particularly in any part of the world. It's really a global problem. Okay, our speaker next is Jairo Lugo-Ocando. For those of you who came late, he's the deputy head of the School of Media and Communication at the University of Leeds, and he was born within driving distance of this place. So, Jairo.
Thank you very much. And I knew I had to sit over there because I would have gone first. And after the brilliant presentations of my colleagues here in the panel, there's not a lot to say. So I'll try to make my intervention more personal and serve that perhaps as a way of generating a discussion about academic citizenship. I did write some notes, and I think they still are relevant on the backdrop of what my colleagues here say. And I start by reminding that Karl Marx famously said that the role of the philosophers, and we are, after all, philosophers, academics, was not only to understand the world, but also to change that world. That might seem nowadays a bit of a radical view in many ways, but perhaps what we need really to understand is what it's meant by changing the world. He, in fact, participated in the Paris Commune of 1871 and gave full support to the insurrection of the Commune once it was established, even though he knew that it was going to fail and that was not really the socialist utopian that he had thought of. However, as we know today, not only the experiment of the Paris Commune failed, as he predicted, but also his ideas were appropriated by some of the most brutal and authoritarian regimes in modern times, which went to commit some of the worst atrocities in history, leaving millions of graves on the way. Going forward 140 years from that, and still as a journalist myself, which was my previous life before becoming an academic, I had the privilege to interview the Polish physicist and Nobel Prize winner Joseph Rotblat, who worked in the Manhattan Project until the end of the Second World War, and then went on to work on nuclear fallout, which became a major contribution toward the ratification of the 1963 partial nuclear treaty ban. He then spent the rest of his life until his death in 2005 actively campaigning for nuclear disarmament. In that interview that I did with him in 1999, when I was still unsure and in between going back to journalism or setting my academic path, I asked him, why did he, Oppenheimer, and other scientists, academics working, why they create such a horrific weapon that could destroy all of us in a single stroke? He answered, because he never thought that humanity would be so stupid and so irrational as to use it, and we were proven wrong. It is in the face of this deontological dilemma that I want to discuss academic citizenship. So let me start by paraphrasing the poet Kahlil Gibran to remind ourselves that our ideas and deeds are not only ours, but they have a life of their own. As with our own younger children, they are our own responsibility, and in a way, they will continue to be for eternity our responsibility. So how do we face these ethical, deontological dilemmas of our intervention in the outside world? In the face of what's going on with academics in places like Turkey, India, even Colombia, where during the 80s, over 150 academics were murdered by right-wing paramilitary groups and the government forces themselves, or by left-wing guerrillas. How do we face this dilemma in a way as a collective body of philosophers, of people who try to contribute with a better world? I cannot answer that question. So let me start by being humble. I can only answer that question not as a collective body, but as an individual. I was, for example, vice president of the UCU, which is the main academic union in Scotland. And I had a lot of problems convincing my colleagues to join the union. Many of them thought that it was not important. Some of them were cheap and they didn't want to pay the fees. Some of them were ideologically against unions. I tried to explain to them that being part of this union of academics were not only good for their own work security and their own working conditions, but as a larger body, a collective body, it could also play a beneficial role in the politics of the whole country. They didn't take it. They were not convinced by my argument, and I did struggle. And in a way, union memberships remain relatively low for the potential that could be in the United Kingdom, particularly after the Thatcher era. I understand the dilemmas that some academics face in this sense. Just to balance family life with activism. You know, I do tell my colleagues, you know, we are privileged. We have a privileged position. In many cases, at least in the UK, being an academic, in most cases, not in all, but in a good proportion of cases, means a stable job, a free space to communicate relatively free ideas, even when they're very controversial, even when they make uncomfortable truth. And this discussion that we're having really is an uncomfortable discussion, because it really positions us to ask us, you know, what is really my degree of engagement, being an individual that enjoys a privileged position. And I think it's because of that privileged position that we enjoy that we have a greater responsibility to answer to society. I think we face, of course, an enormous challenge to answer those dilemmas. Over the past 30 years, the university life has been, I think, in an orchestrated and deliberate way, bureaucratized. Bureaucratization is the best way to control society, to reduce political engagement, to depoliticize minds. Because once you start ticking boxes, doing a lot of more forms and reports, having to comply with increasingly Q quality and assurance assessments, the less you're going to be engaged with that. The more you'll struggle to balance family life. I must say that here there's also a gender issue, you know, and we have to recognize that in this civic engagement of academics, which not only refers to the outside society, but to the inside academic community, we see how our female colleagues are the one who tends to take